Well, I'll tell you what, Willow, 2020 has not turned out the way any of us expected it would when we started this year. And we've all lost something, let's be honest. Whether it's graduation celebrations, weddings that have been postponed, family vacations. Some of us have lost jobs or businesses and even loved ones in this time. And we've all been looking for clarity, looking for some way to move forward, some place of encouragement. And we've been looking forward to being able to gather together for worship in person again. And I want to let you know that as we've studied the situation and prayerfully sought wisdom, that we've made the tough decision to postpone any large indoor, in-person gatherings at our facilities until 2021. That is a tough and probably disappointing decision for people to hear, but we want to serve our church family and our neighbors by prioritizing everybody's health and safety. And so we believe that this is the best path forward. And also, if we're gonna leverage this season to take advantage of the opportunity that this challenge prevents and innovate what the church looks like, then we need to stop sitting and waiting for the day when we can meet safely in large group, and we need to pursue actively ways to engage right here and right now. We need to own that church was never the building anyway, that you and I are the church, and together we can choose to live out the purpose and the power of Christ's kingdom where we live, work, and play. And so we're going to follow the safety guidelines given to us by the authorities, the CDC, regarding how many people can gather at one time indoors. And instead of gathering at 7 locations around Chicagoland, guys, we're going to watch this. We're going to gather in hundreds, thousands of locations, homes, parks, workplaces in Chicagoland and throughout the world. Let's be committed to carrying the love of Jesus into our neighborhoods. Let's pursue ways to bless the people around us who may have lost loved ones or lost jobs. Let's be the church to them. Parents trying to figure out, how do you manage a work schedule when you've got kids home half the time or maybe doing e-learning full time? Let's come alongside them wherever we can. And let's care for those who are lonely, who maybe don't have somebody checking in on them. Let's watch Jesus build and multiply his church, because he has promised that hell itself will not prevail against what the work that he's doing. Let's encourage one another and watch in wonder as God shows us once again that his church will stand, his church will thrive. All right, hey, I want to turn it over to Sean Williams and have him share more ways that we'll be intentionally connecting as a church family, and ways we'll be loving and serving our neighbors at our South Barrington campus over these next few months.
Hey, Willow. I'm so incredibly inspired by Dave's vision for what the church can be during this time. You know, without a doubt, I'm incredibly sad that we can't meet together in our auditorium. But I also have a deep sense of hope that God is going to show up and move in ways that we could have never possibly imagined. Our team has been hard at work brainstorming and planning safe and meaningful ways for our church family to connect and to worship together. And so this August through October, we're going to put up a big tent in the F parking lot with proper social distancing measures. We're planning to host a series of prayer and worship gatherings so that we can seek God together. I'll be there each and every time, and I would love to meet you there as well. We'll be sharing details and dates within the next week. We're also going to open up the tent and some of our other outdoor spaces here on campus for our ministries to host gatherings, volunteer trainings, get-to-know-you events, and whatever else they can dream up. We really want to utilize these spaces, and I pray that it helps you connect with others in these coming weeks. Now, we will continue to stream our weekend service on willowcreek.tv and provide many ways for you to engage both digitally and also in person. You can host a watch party online or join a digital small group, or if you feel comfortable in smaller gatherings, you can open up your home to host church through a Willow at Home group. Many are finding community each and every week as they gather to watch the weekend service together in a backyard, driveway, garage, or living room with some of the other people they know right here at Willow. You can learn more ways of how to get involved at our website at willowcreek.org/nextsteps or through the Willow Creek app. I also encourage you to sign up for our Willow Weekly newsletter. We'll be sending out more information about the prayer and worship nights through there. But Willow, I cannot wait to meet you. And I know that we're not where we'd like to be today or what we would have ever anticipated we'd be at the start of 2020. But I'm praying that this season of uncertainty continues, that we will find firm footing in God's word, encouragement through his church, and joy through doing his work in whatever situation we find ourselves in. I'm truly grateful for you. So now let me toss it back to Dave as he kicks off our brand new series, Jesus Over.
You know, one of the things that attracted me to Jesus in high school was that I met a Christian who had joy even in the midst of sorrow. Yeah, her parents were out of work. She had very little. Her brother was in trouble with the law. She herself had a lot of medical issues. And yet every time I was around her, she had this joy, this strength, this sense of peace and contentment. And I didn't get it. And I was over here in my little comfortable life, had my Atari 2600, my members only jacket. You know, I was doing great. I was, playing sports, working in school. I should have been happier than her. But here's what I noticed. If we won the football game, I was happy. But if we lost the game, I was devastated. I was sorrow-filled. If my dad had a good year in business, we could go on a big vacation, a big trip, well, then I was happy. But if not, sorrow, disappointment. If I made the dean's list, I was happy. But if not, sorrow. Now, don't get me wrong. Hey, I loved high school. It was the best 6 years of my life, okay? Camera guy got it, okay? Hey, listen, it's just that I didn't have what that girl had. When sorrow happened to me, I just didn't have a way to overcome it. And what I realize now is that she had a joy that was based on her relationship with Jesus. And me, I had a happiness or sorrow that was based on my circumstances. It went up and down based on what was going on around me. Now, the Bible doesn't really talk much about happiness, but it says a ton about joy. You know, the words happy and happiness are used 27 times in the Bible, which is like meh, right? That's not very many, but the words joy and rejoice are used 320 times. So in this teaching series, I want to invite us to take a look at the book of Philippians, where joy is mentioned 15 times. It's really one of the major themes of the entire book. In fact, Philippians has one of my favorite verses in all the Bible. It's Philippians 4:4, which is rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. I mean, you talk about relentless positivity, Willow. It's a choice to rejoice. And I realized that was the difference with that girl. That girl in high school, she'd made an intentional choice to overcome the sorrows in her life with a joy, not based on circumstances, but on her relationship with Jesus. How can we do that? How do we see Jesus overcome sorrow in our lives? How do we choose joy? Well, if you have your Bibles, I'm going to be in Philippians 1. Interesting, as you're turning there, Paul writes this letter from prison. Uncomfortable circumstances, uncertain future. Prison in those days was a likely death sentence. And yet, watch how Paul chooses joy. I'm going to be in verse 3. It says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you. He's writing basically a thank you letter to the church in Philippi, who had taken up a collection for him so that he could have food in prison. The prisons back then didn't provide food. You had to have somebody from the outside, or you had to have enough resources yourself to buy food. And Jesus had taught these Christians, if someone's hungry, you feed them. If they're in prison, then you visit them. And these Christians were looking at a brother in prison and supporting him the way that they could. And he was grateful. And so Philippians is really a thank you letter to this church. So he says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always offering prayer with joy in my every prayer for you all. Paul chooses prayer. Now, the Greek word here connotes a kind of prayer of worship. It's a worshiping of God. We choose worship even in hard times. We choose to worship God for who he is and what he's done, and we remember that he is in control. Now, sometimes, if I can get out of the city or out of the suburbs and get out into nature, man, when you look at the mountains and the animals and the rivers, and I just think to myself, man, God's big enough to have all of this under his control. It kind of right sizes my problems. I think to myself, if God can handle all this, then he can handle my issues as well. God is in control. I was in a car a couple of years ago, and I I don't know how to say this. Behind us, red and blue lights come on, and we pull over, and sure enough, officer gets out, asks for license and registration. He asks, do you realize that you were speeding? He heads back to write a ticket, you know? Do you know that feeling you get in that moment? Would you describe that feeling as joy and peace? Well, listen, I wasn't worried at all, no sorrow at all, because my mother-in-law was driving the car, okay? And I love her, but hey, bummer for you, all right? Give God the keys, and then you won't have to worry. If he's the one that's in control, then you don't have to worry about trying to handle everything in your life. God is in control. And guys, God didn't look at 2020 and say, wow, I didn't see that coming. How am I going to handle all of this? Nothing catches God by surprise. This pandemic, COVID-19, racial tension, rioting in the streets, guess what? God's still on the throne. And he's not on the throne leaning forward, wringing his hands, sweating, trying to figure out, how am I going to fix all this mess? That's not how he's on the throne. You want to know how he's on the throne? God's sitting back on the throne. He's taking it easy. He knows what he's going to do. He knows how he's going to bring good out of this mess for those that love him. He's not even stressed. So choose prayer. Take it to God. Worship, even in the midst of sorrow. And do it with thanksgiving, Paul says. You want to have joy even in the midst of sorrow. Develop a discipline of gratitude. One of the things I started doing years ago was writing down 5 things every day that I'm grateful for. I actually use like an online journal. I'll give it to you. It's Penzu, PENZU.com. And you go on there, it's totally free. And I just write down my thoughts every day. I read the Bible, write down my thoughts, and I always list 5 things. And it helps me get my mind off my circumstances and back on Jesus. 5 things that I'm thankful for. 5 ways that I'm seeing God move in my life, even in the midst of hard times. And watch this. I've been doing it for years now. And Penzu actually sends me emails periodically. Every few weeks, I'll get an email that literally says, hey, it'll say, do you want to see what you wrote 3 years ago, 5 years ago? And I can look back and I can see literally miracles that happened in my life. And I can remember all the ways that God has been good and faithful. And it reminds me that he is in control. And you say, well, I haven't been doing that. I don't have stories in my life. Here's another thing. Get in a small group. If you don't have the stories, if you don't have those stories of faithfulness in your life, then get around some people and let's encourage each other with our stories. I was on a call last night preparing for a panel discussion that we're going to do in a few weeks on racial reconciliation
and the church. And one of the men telling his story of growing up on the south side of Chicago and how God basically saved his life. It wasn't my story, but I came away inspired and encouraged, and I had more joy coming out of that call. So listen, choose prayer. Second thing I see Paul choose is Paul chooses God's promises. See, God has made a lot of promises to you and I, 5,467 to be precise. He's got you. And when life isn't going right and you aren't feeling happy, you realize your foundation isn't your circumstances or what happens to you. No, your life is built on God's promises. Here's how Paul puts it in verse 6. He says, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Hey, quick theology lesson here, okay? Now hang with me on this. Let's do a little theology. When we say yes to Jesus, when you become a Christian, two things happen. You are justified, and then you begin to be sanctified. Two theological terms, justified, sanctified. What do they mean? Justified, that's you getting saved. That's your sins are forgiven. You are right with God. I always remember it this way. It is just as if I'd never sinned. And it happens in an instant. It's an event. But sanctified, that's a process. It's a process of refining your character, developing your mind, changing behavior, so that over time you become more like Jesus, growing in your faith. Because even if you've been walking with God for a while, you were, justified years ago, you still have things to work on. You don't believe me, ask your spouse, okay? You do. You have things to work on. Justified is that you are counted as sinless. Sanctified is that you are working on sinning less. Does that make sense? It's like, how many of you own a house? And then how many of you, those same people, are in the process of paying to own that house each month? You both own the house and you are working out that ownership over time. So I say all that. What does sanctification and justification have to do with joy? Okay, so think about it. Sanctification. The more steps I take to be like Jesus, the more freedom and joy I experience. So if my sin is gluttony, well, you take next steps in that area, and the next thing you know, you have more freedom to exercise and to play sports and to feel better. There's just more joy in your life. If your sin is materialism, that's the thing you got to work on. That you can be weighed down. It's tough to retire or send your kids to college because you have all this maybe mountain of debt weighing you down because you couldn't say no to that new thing or that new thing. So you start taking next steps in materialism and you start to discover contentment. You start paying off debt. And the next thing you know, you have some financial freedom, some financial peace, maybe even some joy. If you've ever met somebody in recovering from addiction, and they don't have that substance numbing their mind anymore, or that substance destroying their body anymore, they start to have more energy. They start to be more free in their life. Their relationships start to heal. Guys, sanctification brings joy because it brings freedom. Okay, so that's sanctification. What about justification? What does that have to do with joy? With that, let me take you back to the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. Okay? Now just hang with me here. For 9 years of her life, Mary Lou Retton had worked toward this moment. She needed a 9.95 to earn a tie for the individual all-around gymnastics title. She needed a perfect 10 to win the title outright. And as half the world sat riveted to their television sets, a 16-year-old gymnast hurtled down the runway toward the vaulting horse, hitting the springboard, and she flips through the air and she nails a perfect 10. And the 9,000 spectators leap to their feet, and all the tens and hundreds of thousands of people watching the Olympics online are super excited. She had won. The judges would take the top score of her 2 vaults, and with that first vault, she'd won already. Now imagine what it felt like to walk back and to stand at the end of the runway for that second vault, knowing that she'd already won. And I imagine she was pretty nervous for that first vault, but not the second one. She'd already won. They were going to take the best of either score, so she'd already gotten a perfect 10. She couldn't do any better, so she'd already won. And guys, that's the way we can live as a justified follower of Jesus. It's just as if I'd never sinned, so I don't have to fear losing the prize. I don't have to worry about what other people think of me. We don't have to be afraid to fail because God has already deemed us winners. And it produces in us a freedom, a security in our life, an inexpressible and glorious joy. Guys, choose prayer. Choose God's promises that He who began this work in you is going to carry it on to completion. And then third, choose perseverance. Choose perseverance. Look down at verse 18. It says, yes, I will continue to rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and God's provision of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me, prison, persecution, hard things, it's going to turn out for my deliverance. It's going to turn out okay. You know, Paul persevered through tough times. And listen, we don't like tough times. We want to be safe and comfortable. But God's attitude towards hard things, it's a little different. He tells us in the book of James, he says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. I love that verse. You know what? Think back to a time in your life when you grew the most. Maybe your faith was expanded in a significant way. You felt like you were maturing a lot in your life. You grew in your strength. Whatever it was, let me ask you, how many of you would say that time of growth was connected to a time of significant challenge in your life? You know, I've asked that question before in rooms full of people, and I just have people kind of raise their hand. And I'm telling you, it's like almost everybody in the room. There just seems to be something about going through hard times that if we'll persevere, if we'll move through, it grows us, it matures us. It does exactly what James says in that verse that we just read. And you know, would I choose to go through those tough times again? No, probably not. But now looking back, and maybe it was 6 months ago, maybe it was 6 years ago, maybe it was 60 years ago, but looking back now, you can almost be glad that it happened. Because that tough thing, it shaped us into who we are today. How do you let Jesus overcome sorrow in your life? You choose joy, you choose prayer, you choose God's promises, you choose to persevere. Let that hard thing grow you up. And then finally, choose an eternal perspective. Look at verse 21 here. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. what does that mean? For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. See, Paul's saying, if I survive, if I live, even in this prison, well, then I'm going to live for Jesus. I'm going to live for Christ and his mission. And if I die, well, then that's even better because I get to go be with Christ. He's saying live or die, either way, I can have joy because it's about Jesus. I love what he says later on in chapter 4. He says this, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. He says, I can do all of this through him who gives me strength. See, he's choosing an eternal perspective, which is one of the keys to having joy. Have you ever played that board game Life? It was invented back in 1860 by Milton Bradley. It was, for years, the most popular board game in the United States. It's in the National Toy Hall of Fame. I didn't even know there was such a thing, but it is. And it's also in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., that museum. And there's still a modern version of Life that you can go to a store and buy today. You can still play the game today. But in the game of life, sometimes you get a good spin on the wheel, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you make it into college and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you buy a house, you make big, great business deals, and you make it to millionaire acres. That's kind of the goal of the game, but sometimes you don't. You lose everything. So many different ways it can go in the game of life, and every time you play, it's always different. It's always different, except for one thing. Every game of life ends the same way. You pick up the board and all the pieces, and everything just goes back in the box. The money, the cars, all of it. And you get back to what's real. So many ways that my life and your life can go. Sometimes you'll land just the right job, and sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll get the pay increase, but sometimes you won't. Sometimes your friends, they'll support you, but sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll let you down. Sometimes you'll get an all clear from the doctor, but sometimes you won't. But guess what happens at the end of our life? At the end of every one of our lives, in a sense, it all goes back in the box. We all, as morbidly as this sounds, we all end up in a box. So choose an eternal perspective. For me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. In other words, the end of the game for all of God's kids is good. The best is truly yet to come. We can have joy regardless of our circumstances because we know that everything this side of heaven, it just doesn't even compare to what's coming. So, hey guys, let's keep praying together every day at 2:42. Let's stay relentlessly positive. I love you. We will get through this together. And I'll say it again, the best is yet to come.